So I want to welcome everyone to this book launch, this virtual book launch for No Place for the State, the Origins and Legacies of the 1969 Omnibus Bill. So this is how this is going to work. We haven't done a virtual book launch before. This is my fourth book, but first virtual book launch. It's not quite as good. There's no food that is provided by the press or anyone else, so that's all right. But we do get the chance to do this, so I like that. The way it's going to work is I will, for some reason, act as MC, I suppose, because I'm one of the editors throughout the session. We're going to start off in a few moments with Lara Campbell, who is not a contributor to the book in the usual sense, but she did contribute a quotation, a blurb, which says very nice things about the book, and she has generously agreed to say a few things as an introduction to what this book is. Christabelle, Sethna, and I'm Christopher Dummitt, one of the editors, that we will each say a few things about how this book came together, where it came from, and what we think it means now, as a kind of prefatory comments. And then each of the contributors who can be here, there are a couple who can't, but each of the contributors who can be here will speak for 3 minutes. And we're all going to try and keep it brief. I think it's just the incredible, nice highlights from their chapters, sort of saying, so that give you a sense of what is in this book and what is in their particular chapters. Once that is done, there's a brief question and answer session. And we're very keen to have any questions that you might have. I can direct your attention to the bottom of your screen in Zoom. If you kind of scroll over the screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A button on the bottom right-hand side. And you can sort of identify that you would like to ask a question. And when we come to you can do that at any point. And when it comes to the question and answer session, Radimus, our secret tech guru, will then unmute your microphone and call on you and allow you to ask your question. And you can direct it to any of the editors or contributors at any point, and we can go from there. At the very final point, we will have Christabelle Sethna come on and say the last words, and then we will let you go before urging you to purchase the book if you would like. And if you didn't catch what I said this earlier, UBC Press, the publisher of the book, of course, academic books can sometimes be a little expensive. There's no doubt about that. But they have, for this book launch for today and tomorrow, provided a 50% discount on anyone who would like to buy the book. And so you can go to the UBC Press website, search the title of the book, find it, and you can order it using the discount code STATE. Discount code is STATE. Okay, that's my introductory point to kind of give us the logistics of it. Have I forgotten anything, Christabelle?
I don't think so, but it's my first virtual book launch as well. So I think we're trying to do our best.
Great.
Yeah.
So I want to now, it's my pleasure to really introduce Lara Campbell from Simon Fraser University, who has very generously agreed to lead us off here. So thanks very much, Lara.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris and Christabelle and UBC Press for asking me to participate tonight and to provide just a very brief welcome and introduction. I'm really, really happy to join you all tonight from Vancouver on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of the individual authors this evening. So I'm just going to say a few very, very brief words about this collection as a whole. First of all, I really enjoyed reading it immensely, and you can't say that about every edited collection in the world. There really is no other one like it in Canada, which I have to admit I found a little bit surprising. And sometimes, you know, when I was reading through the collection, I wonder if the Omnibus Bill of 1969 is used mainly as a backdrop by historians to talk about these larger social and cultural changes of the late 1960s. But I promise if you read through this collection, you'll appreciate why it's so important to engage closely with legislative change. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about the collection as a whole. Each author in this collection engaged provocatively with the bill itself and its implications. So it's really of interest to social historians, cultural historians, political historians, legal historians. And the result is a fascinating and wide-ranging exploration of modernity, birth control, abortion, feminism, religion, gay liberation, divorce, and perhaps most evocatively, the relationship between grassroots activism and state actors. So thank you, Chris and Christabelle, and to all the authors for your hard work. I know how difficult it is to pull an excellent collection together, and I really look forward to hearing what everyone has to say tonight. So we will turn this now back over to Chris, who will introduce you to each of the authors.
Thanks, Lara. Much appreciated. And almost, we didn't plan this at all, but everything you say sort of fits some of the things I'm going to say as well a bit later on. I just wanted to give people a sense of where this book came from. Interestingly, it came over an alcoholic beverage, which all good books should originate in that fashion. And I called up Christabelle Sethna in Ottawa, and I was going to Ottawa, I'm going to be there. And I asked her if she'd have a drink with me and about 9 other PhD students who I was supposed to be teaching and having dinner with. And then I proceeded to ignore the PhD students and talk to Christabelle about this idea I had for this workshop about the Omnibus Bill. And although she had about 6,000 other projects on, as I think she does, for some reason said yes, she would agree to help me organize this workshop around the theme of the Omnibus Bill and a whole series of the issues it brings up, especially around the history of sexuality and going outwards from there. So the reason I wanted to do it, and this really picks up on what Lara was saying, is that for me, as I was teaching over the last number of years, this was a while ago now, I kept mentioning the Omnibus Bill in lectures, and I kept talking about it, and not really about the Omnibus Bill, but it just kept coming up at the confluence of a whole series of other issues. And like Lara was saying, it's a place where the politics of the streets was meeting the politics in Parliament. And there were some interesting dynamics happening here. And I thought we needed to spend a bit more time just talking in a bunch of different fashions about this. I wanted to hear what other scholars had to say. One of the great things is that at Trent University, where I teach, one of the great wonders of this collection is that we decided to have a workshop there. We would invite all the contributors to come, kind of workshop their papers, and we would go to this place called Windy Pine, which is a cottage facility out near Halburn. And Windy Pine was given to Trent, and not just to Trent, but to Canadian Studies at Trent, where I teach, by this woman called Mary Northway. And Mary Northway was the inheritor of a rather large estate in the early mid 20th century that she didn't know what to do with, and so she ended up creating this camp for young women at a time when to taking them on backcountry camping when that kind of thing was not done at many other camps for women. But Mary Northway also, after the camp finished, she also lived there for years with her partner. Mary Northway was a lesbian woman and had her partner there. And Windy Pine became this retreat for a lot of women who were quite professional women, didn't fit in their time. And although she never sort of identified as a lesbian, that's obviously in some ways we would think of her now in that way. And I think it's so wonderful that we came to have this conference debating this bill, which was so pivotal in many ways about these issues at this facility donated by Mary Northway to Trent for us to have exactly these kinds of conversations. So I was so pleased that everyone could come and we could workshop the papers. And then through a lot of other editing and other, a lot of patience and trial and error, we finally come to have this book here. So I want to turn it over now to my co-editor, Christabelle Sethna.
Thank you, Chris. Could we have the next slide, Rodimus? Great, thank you. So Chris Dummitt asked me to be his co-editor, as he said some years ago, and I agreed. I remember a phone call and then alcoholic beverages. Maybe not in that order, I'm not sure. But I was really happy that Chris asked me to be co-editor. I thought it was a terrific idea, and I still do. And I think we all have had the opportunity now to mark the 50th anniversary of this momentous legislation. The 1969 Omnibus Bill was a massive piece of legislation. It was 126 pages long. It tackled several matters, including the reforms for which it became famous or infamous, reforms dealing with human sexuality, which for the purposes of this edited collection are birth control, homosexual acts, and abortion. Now, I want to say that it is impossible to mark the 50th anniversary of the Omnibus Bill without dealing with another anniversary, that of the abortion caravan. For those of you who don't know, the brainchild, the abortion caravan was the brainchild of the Vancouver Women's Caucus. And the caravan left Vancouver in early May 1970, arriving in Ottawa on May 9th, Mother's Day, to protest the new reforms to abortion legislation contained in the Omnibus Bill. Ironically, the reforms, which were meant to curtail illegal abortion in Canada, made getting a legal abortion in a timely fashion nearly impossible. So in my earlier work, I acknowledged the importance of the Omnibus Bill, but like Chris said about his own work, it was something that was in the background. I didn't really take it into consideration until I first worked with Steve Hewitt on RCMP surveillance of the women's liberation movement, resulting in the 2009 publication on the Vancouver Women's Caucus and the abortion caravan as it made its way across Canada. And then we were able to link the caravan to the passage of the Omnibus Bill more closely. The lockdown that we are now facing has led to many changes in how we can honor the caravan's anniversary and obviously the anniversary of this Omnibus Bill. So I would like to do a little bit of this honoring by saying thank you to the Vancouver caucus members and the caravanners, some of whom are in the audience tonight, for the rage, courage, and daring that you expressed in your journey from Vancouver to Ottawa 50 years ago. Your activism kick-started a journey that would culminate years later with the Supreme Court of Canada striking down the abortion law in 1988. Thank you to colleagues like Angus McLaren and Arlene McLaren, Janine Brody, Shelley Gavigan, Jane Jensen, Ruth Roach Pearson, Frances Wasserline, Ann Thompson, Beth Palmer, Katrina Ackerman, Nancy Yanovicek, Tracy Penny Light, and Shannon Stetner. I know there are more, for putting abortion on history's map and for continuing to inspire us with your scholarship. And finally, thank you to the next generation, the caravanners' granddaughters and great-granddaughters, who with this history and historiography are equipped to know, as the caravanners still do, that your hard-fought and hard-won battles must never be taken for granted. Thank you, Chris, for allowing me the opportunity to co-edit this wonderful collection with you.
Okay, thanks, Christabelle. Okay, I guess I'm continuously here, but I'm here at the moment because my chapter comes first in the book after the introduction. So we're going to begin that section now where each of us will give about a 3-minute chat about just explaining what our chapter is. My chapter is, the reason I think it's first, there we go, is it's a front picture of it there, page of it, you can see there. Well, actually, no, I think you've got the introduction, but we'll get there. My chapter opens, I think, because it covers the parliamentary debate. It covers the debate that first happened in 1967 when Trudeau, as Justice Minister, Pierre Trudeau as Justice Minister, first introduced the legislation, and then again in 1969 when a revised version, but very similar version, was debated in Parliament. And I cover that period of time that debate as a way of getting into how a series of individuals at the time really thought of and discussed this bill, and I do that for two purposes. One, because one is a kind of a very historical reason is that I want to get at what it meant at the time. It's quite hard as historians, as people looking back on the past, however we want to understand the word historian, to understand what something meant in the past. We're always shaped, of course, by our subsequent experiences, our thoughts about what happened, what we know to happen, what we forget happened or didn't happen. And I wanted to recreate in some ways the many different meanings that it had in 1969, which are not the meanings for many people at the time that we've subsequently come to think of it that way. So it's a very historical version. I want to say, what did this actually mean in 1969 at a time when maybe the bill wouldn't have been passed, or not with all of its measures, or maybe it could have been passed with modified measures. So that's one thing. And then really the second purpose of the chapter is I make an argument that says that I see what happens in the parliamentary debate. You see in the origins, the debates around sexuality, around abortion, around birth control, and a number of other things, but these things in particular at this time. You see what I argue is a new kind of morality happening, a new morality which is slowly chipping away at a kind of broadly Christian morality, which had been dominated Canadian legal codes and social life and cultural life for at least the previous century. And the new morality, I call it a morality of the self, right? A morality of the individual rights, of authenticity, as the philosopher Charles Taylor would say, of individual autonomy and respecting that autonomy. And I call it a morality of itself because it had its own, moral implications. The idea that to respect this was quite good. You could, a different example, I'm going to finish with this. If you want to understand the difference between a new morality of the self and an older morality of the self, one example you could give this, or you could use to get this across, is the words which are taboo under either versions of it. I can show up now at a time when I would say the morality itself is quite accepted. I can show up in a classroom and swear, and maybe even in a book launch, say a word like, am I allowed to say shit? Or I could say the F word. I probably won't, but I probably couldn't. I probably wouldn't offend too many people in this format. But there are a bunch of other words that have to do with identity and respecting identity that, if I said, would be really offensive, and I would consider them offensive as well. And it's in that transition from the words we think of as and the issues we think of as taboo that I think you can see this new morality of itself. And I see the Omnibus Bill and its debates around sexuality, homosexuality, abortion, choice, individual liberty, that as one of these kinds of key transition moments, like a kind of convergence when that new morality of the self really begins to play up and show up on the streets and in Parliament. So that's what I try to do in the outset of the book in my introduction. Okay, I'm going to pause there. And I'm very happy to turn to, our second chapter actually has 3 authors. 2 of them are here, but I think I've been told that the person who's going to speak to this is Bruce Douville there. Katrina Ackerman, one of the authors, is also here, and Shannon Sethna, one of the other authors, is not here. So Bruce, turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Everything you just said really is a good segue to talking about this, because ultimately our chapter deals with basically Canadian debates over the morality of abortion, because inevitably when people are debating abortion, it's almost inevitable that it will end up being a debate about religion. And this was as true in the 1960s and 1970s as it is today, because Canadian Christians have long viewed abortion as a moral and religious issue. And prior to the 60s, the official position of most Canadian churches, whether Protestant or Roman Catholic, was that abortion was the destruction of human life and that it was abhorrent to Christian conscience. But in the 1960s, and in the early 1960s, that changes. Okay, in Canada's largest Protestant churches, there's this shift in opinion and in official church positions on that matter. And this shift was most evident in the United Church of Canada. Now, I think what you can see here, the visual that you're looking at is from the March 1974 issue of the United Church Observer, which is their monthly publication. And what you have here is a debate between A.C. Forrest, who was the editor of the United Church Observer for a very long time, and thus, somebody who was fairly well respected in the United Church establishment, and Harriet Christie. Harriet Christie was a top-level official in the United Church hierarchy. She was head of the Board of Women and later on the Division of Mission. And so what you have here are 2 prominent United Church members with different positions on the issue. And in some ways, this really illustrates some of the division that we found in our research. Now, the thing is, when we look at this time period in the United Church in the earlier periods, say before the 1960s, as I say, they pretty much had the standard view on abortion. Okay, this was the destruction of human life. It was abhorrent to Christian conscience. But by the mid 60s, this is definitely changing, and it's really evident with top-level officials in the United Church, people like Ray Hord, who are saying, no, we need to look at this in a different light. And by 1971, you actually have a gathering of United Church lay members and clergy from across Canada that get together at their annual meeting, and they endorse a statement that abortion should be a matter between a woman and her physician, and that abortion should be removed from the criminal code. So really, over the space of a decade, there's almost like a sea change that takes place within the United Church. But the thing is, this also led to a significant pushback from a substantial vocal minority of church members. And when I say a minority, these were not fringe members. Okay, A.C. Forrest, who you see here in the visual on the left side, was a very prominent church member. And the divides were not necessarily between conservative and liberal or between fundamentalist and non-fundamentalist. The divides did not really look like they do today in terms of the so-called culture war over abortion. But the point is that this vocal minority within the church was definitely at odds with the leadership of the United Church. They were at odds with the denomination's official position. So why is all of this important? Well, because the United Church of Canada was Canada's largest Protestant Christian denomination in the 60s and 70s. So if you want to understand how many English Canadians perceived abortion as a moral and religious issue, it makes sense to look at the church's rapidly evolving position on abortion in the decade leading up to the Omnibus Bill and the decade following the Omnibus Bill, and how that support for and opposition to that position played out in the church. And in a nutshell, that's what Katrina Ackerman and Shannon Sethna and I were looking at when we approached this topic. And I think that what we've written here sheds a lot of light on the matter.
Thanks so much. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've probably run out of time.
I hate being the timekeeper. It's always vicious to come in. But I always remember at earlier time when I was timekeeper and I did a terrible job and people got very upset with me. So, but I think it was nicely put, Bruce. Thanks so much. And again, I'll just remind people now that when people have questions for Bruce and Katrina and all the authors, please enter them in the Q&A section there, and we'll come to people at the very end. Okay, I want to now turn to Gary Kinsman, who is the author of the next chapter in the collection. Gary.
Hi, I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Atikamekw Anishinaabeg Nation and the lands of other Anishinaabe people, sometimes referred to as Sudbury. My remarks tonight are also in solidarity with the rebellions in Minneapolis against the police murder of George Floyd and with those protesting the police killing of Regis Korchinski-Raquette in Toronto yesterday. Black Lives Matter. My chapter is based on the extensive historical research I have done for my book, The Regulation of Desire, and for my Wolfenden in Canada book chapter. It focuses on the gay and lesbian activism that precedes the '69 reform and opened up space for it, activism from below. It focuses on the law reform itself in detail, and also the escalation of sexual policing of our lives that comes after the reform. This places my research and experiences in direct rupture with those accounts that celebrate a mythology, in my view, that the '69 reform, supposedly as a gift from above, legalized or decriminalized homosexuality. And there's strands of that approach that actually enter into the pages of No Place for the State as well. My chapter starts with the statement that you would have just seen by Cherry DeNovo and Brian Waite for the We Demand demonstration on Parliament Hill in August 1971, which was the first cross-country protest for gay and lesbian rights. You see a photo of it here on the screen taken by Gerald Moldenhauer. Central to the We Demand demonstration in August '71 was a critique of the limitations of the '69 reform. Despite this mythology that the '69 reform decriminalized or legalized homosexuality, it actually only addressed 2 homosexual-related offenses. A partial exception to criminalization was provided for buggery, usually covering anal sex, and gross indecency, usually covering oral sex, but only if it was conducted in a narrow private realm, basically behind bedroom doors, and only involving 2 people aged 21 and over. Everything else remained criminalized. Other offenses were not addressed. Queer sex was still continued to be indecent and was not allowed in the broad public realm, or involving those under the age of 21, which was an age of consent that was much higher than for most heterosexual sex that was then set at 14. The police were directed by the '69 reform itself to go after queer sex in the public realm. And this policing escalated with mass arrests in the '70s and '80s. Regulations over those who were seen to only be engaging in sex with one other person over the age of 21 in private were shifted to the regulatory jurisdictions of psychiatrists, counselors, and doctors, as they were now reclassified as being sick, but not necessarily criminal. There's far more information on the limitations of the '69 reform on the Anti-69 site, which I was involved in organizing at anti69.ca. Some of the discussions that actually led towards Anti-69 started while we were working on the book chapters, and here I'm talking about Karen, Tom, and myself. The '69 reform was a key part of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's notion of a just society. This focused on individual and not social and collective rights. A central part of this project was the white paper and the attempt to annihilate Indigenous sovereignty. In these years, there were also shifts in racist immigration policies, and major forms of anti-Black racism continued with the destruction of Africville in Nova Scotia and the repression of protesters against anti-Black racism at Sir George William University in 1969. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, with another paper quite linked to that, I'm going to turn to Tom Hooper now. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So I just want to first say thank you to UBC Press and the organizers of this launch. I'm very glad to be here. So my academic background wasn't initially on the 1969 reform. Instead, my primary focus as a historian has been the Toronto bathhouse raids. In particular, the infamous raids on February 5th, 1981, in which more than 300 men were arrested for committing acts of indecency in a common body house. 12 years after 1969. In the grand narratives of Canadian history, I learned, like everyone else, that homosexuality was decriminalized in 1969. But the deeper I got into my research, I discovered that 1969 was anything but a decriminalization. The men I interviewed as part of my research, who were arrested under the Criminal Code's body house section, had strong feelings that for them, 1969 was not decriminalization. So the community reaction in 1981 seemed to mirror this attitude. Immediately after the bath raids, Canada's gay liberation news magazine, The Body Politic, published an article entitled "Body House Law, the State's Key to the Bedroom Door," riffing off of Pierre Trudeau's statement about bedrooms of the nation. So this is the purpose of my chapter. I'm looking at the community's response to the 1969 reforms in an era of mass criminalization. Now, this is important because most of the academic studies on the 1969 reform have been about big national discussions on homosexuality, save for Gary Kinsman, of course. What was published in the Globe and Mail? These are the questions. What was published in Saturday Night? What did the Prime Minister say about bedrooms? What was said in the parliamentary debates? So for these folks, 1969 was decriminalization. They accomplished something great. But what about the queer people on the ground? What about their encounters with the police? So as a historian of the community, this is how I measure decriminalization. The fact is, no laws related to homosexuality were repealed. Queer sex remained defined in law as a crime. And most importantly, the number of queers arrested and prosecuted for indecent criminal acts didn't go down after 1969, they went up. This is why I take issue with the term partial decriminalization. After all, arrests didn't partially go down, they went up. So on the ground, this was the opposite of decriminalization. Now, I just want to close by saying I think we need to ask ourselves, if the myth of decriminalization in 1969 doesn't serve the people who were actually criminalized, who does it serve? Whose political legacies are being written over top of the experiences of our community on the streets? And who in our community is cashing in on this myth? Now, if you want to learn more about this critique, please see our Anti-69 website. As Gary said, I just want to edit though, it's www.anti-69.ca. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tom. We're going to turn now to Steve Hewitt, who is the co-author of another chapter with Christabelle Sethna. I'm a co-editor, but Steve is going to speak, I think, although Christabelle is there as well, so great.
So hi, everyone. Greetings. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm here in Birmingham in the UK, where it is now just past 12:30 a.m. on Friday. So I'm actually in the future in a sense. And I'd like to thank UBC Press for putting this event on. And I'd like to thank Chris and Christabelle for editing this collection and creating the vision that led to it. And I owe a double thank you to Christabelle because she co-authored this chapter with me. And this is part of a long collaboration I've had with Christabelle going back 24 years. And she's been a great collaborator and an even greater friend. So I'd like to pay tribute to her. So I'm in the sort of section that kind of follows on from Tom about resistance to the Omnibus Bill. And this is looking at specifically at the issue of abortion and the efforts to, in effect, we call this reform, to actually overturn the reforms. And specifically, this came out of the book that Christabelle and I did 2 years ago called Just Watch Us, which was about RCMP surveillance of the women's liberation movement, and specifically an event which Christabelle already mentioned, which was the 1970 abortion caravan, where a group called the Vancouver Women's Caucus organized this cross-country protest against the rules that laws still in place after the so-called reforms of 1969, and traveled across to Ottawa and literally ended up on the lawn of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau as part of the protest, and then later, actually, the next day, disrupted a session in the House of Commons. The House of Commons had to shut down. So this is the chapter, and the chapter is focused on a group that emerges after the caravan called the Toronto Women's Caucus, which continued the protest against the abortion legislation. But there's another aspect to this chapter. There's sort of three aspects to this chapter. One is about the resistance against the state, the contestation of this new policy on the part of the Toronto Women's Caucus, but other groups as well that would emerge, and this would go on literally for decades, and in some ways obviously continues today because there still remains issues around the right of women to reproductive rights. But the other two angles, one involves divisions in the women's movement, specifically the involvement of Trotskyists in the groups like the Toronto Women's Caucus, and you said some divisions within the women's movement. But the third aspect, which is the other kind of main aspect of the story, and the document has just popped up on the screen now, involves the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because behind the scenes, throughout this period, and we're talking decades, you've got the RCMP carrying out surveillance against the Toronto Women's Caucus and groups and individuals. And we can see here, this is actually a police document listing some of the individuals. You can see that there's a gray strip where file numbers have been removed by access to information. We obtained this through access to information through Library and Archives Canada. So there's this third aspect that's going on behind the scenes, where you've got the RCMP through open surveillance, through open source material, but also through infiltrating these groups, sometimes through recruiting female informants who are either already in some of these groups or who are on the outside and are infiltrated in to keep track of what is going on. And this is part of this relationship. It's contestation where you've got the groups challenging the Omnibus Bill reforms, but then you've got the state, in a sense, monitoring the activities of women and others who are protesting against this movement. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'm glad we got to connect with you. All right, we're about halfway through, a bit more than halfway through. Our next contributor is Jessica Haynes.
Thank you, everyone. It's really very lovely to be here with you this evening. I wanted to start just by thanking Christopher and Christabelle for all the work they did editing this amazing collection. It's really been great to be part of it over the last few years. And so I'll just say a few things about my chapter. It approaches the question of the 1969 Omnibus Bill from a slightly different angle. And it's based on my PhD thesis, which examined the impact of the birth control pill on married women in Canada who took it when it first came out in the 1960s. And what was really interesting was, as I explored the question of that impact through oral history, the Omnibus Bill and the fact that until 1969 it was actually legal to sell or dispose of contraception really didn't come up very often for the married women I spoke to. Many of them were unaware or simply not very concerned about the fact that contraception was illegal. And in fact, for many married women, contraception really was, as the image from Chateauin in 1961 that you see on the screen suggests, it really was something that nobody talked about very much. It was very private, and that was one of the reasons why I embraced oral history, because it was really the only way I could get to tell the stories that I wanted to tell in my thesis. And so when I spoke to women who very generously gave their time and shared a lot with me, I found that the pill really was very transformative for them, and that there were barriers to access, that they focused a lot more. For them, it was very important that they were married or about to be married. They felt that being single was, at least in the early 60s, a barrier to getting the pill. They talked about the price, and they sometimes talked about religion, because that was a big problem for some of them that they wrestled with if they were Catholic. So it really was a very interesting journey with them through their stories. And as I reflect back on it, I did those interviews over 10 years ago now. And as I was doing the interviews, it struck me at times how, in some ways, my life was similar to the women I was interviewing. They had been married. I was married. Many of them their families had been in Canada for generations, as had mine. Almost all of them did end up having children. And as became increasingly obvious through the interview process, I was pregnant with my first child, who turned 10 yesterday. So now, as the mother of 3 daughters, I think back about my research, and I think about their choices going forward, and how they will hopefully have even more options than I did, than the women in the 60s certainly did. But the struggle for access, the struggle for reproductive freedom is ongoing, as we're seeing even today, and somewhat exacerbated by our current situation for many of us in a pandemic and in lockdown. So thank you. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Jessica. And belated happy birthday to your daughter.
Thank you.
Okay, and now I'd like to call on Karen Pearlston.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me? Maybe they can't hear me. You can hear me. Thank you.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm speaking today from unceded Wolastoqey territory in what's currently known as Fredericton, New Brunswick. And I'll echo all the thanks everyone's given to UBC Press and to the editors, but I want to especially thank Christabelle for talking about the abortion caravan. I'll just add that it's not, abortion isn't a historical matter. I think people are aware that abortion is under attack now quite a bit in Canada and other parts of the world, but especially where I'm situated in Fredericton, we have been engaged in an ongoing struggle for abortion access and access to Medicare-funded clinic abortions that continues. So as I do whenever I talk to a national audience, I ask you for your solidarity with what we're trying to do in New Brunswick and currently with our campaign to save Clinic 554. Now, I didn't write about abortion for this book. I wrote about lesbians and lesbian legal history, and I'm speaking from my background as a law professor and as a very long time activist. And as I was preparing for this event, it occurred to me that my chapter, which is called The State's Place in the Bedrooms of Lesbian Nation, could also have been called A Tale of Two Laws, criminal law and family law, because in the chapter, I argued that lesbians weren't directly affected by the limited amendments to the criminal prohibition of buggery and gross indecency, because those two laws were specifically about sex between men. And Anglo-Canadian law did not explicitly prohibit sex between women. So even after 1954, when gross indecency was amended in Canada to be a gender-neutral offense, it was rare for it to be used against lesbians, and when it wasn't in the official law reports. At least Chenier has done fantastic work on what was actually happening there. My work, however, focuses on cases from the law reports where police arrested opposite-sex couples who were having sex in cars or other places that could be construed as public. And my chief finding in that context is that those couples were acquitted of the charges. And I think that's because leading legal scholars and the judges who heard the cases, were persuaded that the law of gross indecency, if applied to sex between a man and a woman, was a threat to heterosexual men. So they acquitted opposite sex couples of the same crime for which gay men were regularly convicted. And they could do this because they developed the reasoning that whether heterosexuals had committed gross indecency could be determined by the time, place, and circumstances in which the act took place. So oral sex between men was classified as inherently grossly indecent, but oral sex between a man and a woman was not. And why not? Because it was heterosexual and could not be conceptually because it was heterosexual and it could be connected to marriage. So as you know, the 1969 exception to the law against buggery and indecency was, as Tom Hooper has written, based on monogamy. And I would argue also it was heterosexual monogamy as the model. The second law was the Divorce Act 1968. And the 1968 Divorce Act gave a spouse the ability to divorce the other spouse if that spouse had committed a homosexual act since the celebration of the marriage. Now, this new ground for divorce was added to the legislation by Pierre Trudeau after a Conservative MP complained that the proposed legislation was possibly not exact enough to rescue men from marriages in which the female partner is a practicing lesbian. So that is the first instance of Canadian law regulating lesbians as lesbians. It remained in the law until the Divorce Act was repealed and replaced in 1985, which of course, the period from 1968 to 1985 was also the period in which lesbians were becoming publicly visible for the first time in North America. I don't have time to tell you any more about it now. I'll just say that I was also one of the anti-69 organizers, and I think that my chapter supports the anti-69 case against the mythology of the 1969 criminal code reforms. It also reminds us that there's more to queer legal history than the history of gay men, and more to queer legal history than then the history of homosexuality is a crime. So Pierre Trudeau said, what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code, but at the same time, he used family law to target lesbians.
Okay, thanks, Karen, that was great. Now I'm going to turn to Isabelle Perreault.
Yeah, thank you. First, I would like to thank Chris and Christabelle for their work, but also Steph Good, who translated my chapter in English. So thank you. So in this chapter, I examined the judicial archives, to be precise, more the criminal court records and coroner's inquest in Montreal from 45 to 75, and also debates and archives in Ottawa regarding two things. So first, the partial decriminalization of abortion in '69, and second, the total decriminalization of attempted suicide in '72. So these records demonstrate that the criminal justice system was not the best institution to regulate such behavior, mainly because the intent of the system is to prevent crime, detect it sometimes, but mostly dissuade through the possibility of punishment. So first, abortions and suicide are mostly private acts, and few complaints were reported to police officers, except, for example, when someone wanted to throw him or herself in the river in front of strangers, or when a woman died from septicemia. So the biggest cases I found were in the 70s, and it was, of course, Morgenthaler and Maccabee. Also, the dissuasion effect was not really effective, so decisions to abort or take your own life are multifactorial, and the notion of jail time as a result is not the best way to diminish the rate of moral crimes. So unsurprisingly, medical experts effectively replaced the justice system, trying to regulate abortion practices and suicidal ideas and acts in a different way. For example, public health and psychiatry specialists still tried to discourage people to take their own life. Mainly the message is that we are not allowed to freely give ourselves death, except when it's decided in a medical context supported by the new law a few years ago, as you know, medically assisted death. Which reminds strangely of therapeutic committees for abortion established after '69. So showing that change of regulation from the criminal justice system to the medical one, I end this chapter talking about biopolitics and questioning which life worth living more than the others. I also question the fact that increasingly people integrate the narrative of choice, even of free will, regarding abortion and suicide, though it is still morally and sometimes socially punished. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabelle. Okay, I'm going to say finally. I don't want to say finally because I think there's some injustice that Laurie is going last, because I just will say that every time Christabelle and I sent out an email to any of our contributors, Laurie would respond within, I think, about 30 seconds. She has an email is incredibly quick at responding. So I feel like it's very unjust that we've made you wait to the last, but thank you, Laurie.
I never mind waiting, so no problem, Chris and Christabelle. Thank you so much for including me in this collection. I was very excited to make my contribution. So I'm Laurie Chambers. I'm coming to you from what we currently call Thunder Bay, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people and the Fort William First Nation. And I want to say first that my chapter in this book is part of a larger project. It's an adapted and expanded idea from the final chapter of a book that I wrote on adoption, published in 2016. And really, it takes a different approach to 1969 than the other papers in this book, because adoption isn't talked about at all in the Omnibus Bill. This is not something that was intended to change in 1969, but it's one of the unintended consequences of the Omnibus Bill that we had a change in demand for children for adoption. So previously to 1969, in the 60s, more broadly speaking, we're already seeing a drop in the availability of white babies for the kind of demand for the heterosexual creation of the heterosexual family in the post-war period, which had been met primarily through the babies of the unmarried white mothers who had been in homes for unmarried mothers, or through the Children's Aid Society had been forced to give their children up for adoption. They stopped doing this in such large numbers slowly over the course of the 1960s, but this is accelerated dramatically by the partial decriminalization of abortion and the full decriminalization of birth control, so that we have dramatically reduced rates, both of illegitimacy itself, but then also of relinquishment of infants, because you also have a transformation, of people have spoken up earlier tonight, in morality, broadly speaking, in the 60s, so that there's less shame around having the product of an illegitimate relationship, i.e. a child. And there's also the growing welfare state, so women have options. So what happens? In the 60s, you have the 60s scoop, Indigenous children being taken off reserve and being placed in white families, and we all know the horrific consequences of that. But by the early 1970s, Indigenous communities are protesting this quite loudly, and the unintended consequence of 1969, in combination with all of these events, is that we have the dramatic rise over the 1970s and into the 80s of international adoption of infants. And the interesting piece about it, and the thing that I explore in this chapter, is that it's completely unregulated in the early years. And even all of the rules around trying to ensure that there are good parents for children simply don't apply until much later on. So there's a gap, a period when international adoption is really unregulated. And this is not just true in Canada or Ontario, it's true elsewhere. And this leads to significant international controversy about the issue of international adoption. So in my chapter, I look at the role of the legislation of 1969 in this process, and thereby look at sort of unintended consequences of the legislation, which I think is also an interesting way of looking at legislative reform. What did they intend to do? And then what happened that they didn't intend is also an interesting piece. So that's it.
Thanks, Lori. All right, well, that is all the contributors who are here. I would say Scott de Groot also has written a very nice chapter on gay liberation movements and discussions around that that also shows up in the book. And am I forgetting anyone else, Christabelle? I feel like terrible that I am. I don't think I am.
No, I think we've already said that unfortunately Shannon Sethna could not be here, but I think that wraps up the presentation part.
All right, so now it is possible for people, and we'd love it if any of the attendees or anyone else would like to ask questions, any thoughts you have, anything you'd like to share, be happy to have that. I believe the way it's going to work is there's the little Q&A button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, or center right side of your screen. You identify yourself there for a question. Radimus, our tech guru, who's been so great at putting these together, will let us know. And I don't see anyone.
Chris, if I just want to, also there is a raised hand. So if you don't want to write the question, you can just raise your hand and I will give you the privilege to speak. That will turn on your mic. So you can either write the question in the Q&A or raise your hand.
And by raise your hand, Radimus, are you speaking? Because
yes, I can see them. Yes, I can.
You can see everyone else. We can't. You're a very privileged person.
Yeah.
Right.
So far, no one raised their hands, or no one.
There's also a chat, like a little chat function, so people can write in their questions. If you don't have any questions, maybe the contributors have questions for each other. Does any contributor have a question for a colleague?
Yes, so we have someone raise their hands. It's Marina Marot.
Yes.
Yes, you can unmute yourself and you can speak. Marina, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Marina.
Hi there. I'm here from Toronto, and I was really excited to hear about this book and to hear all of the contributors. Really exciting collection. It's very much piqued my interest. I had a question. I thought it was so interesting in all of the discussions about sort of the tensions around this omnibus bill. So, for some of you, you're talking about how, it promised something that it didn't deliver, especially on the ground. And then for others, you do sort of suggest that there was something, some parts of it that were progressive or led to some progressive changes. So I just wondered if whether the editors or any of the contributors sort of want to talk about that tension and just comment on it a little bit.
Christabelle, you want to go first, or I know?
No, you go. You go ahead.
I think Gary raised his hand. You go ahead, Gary.
Maybe just one point I'll add in, because there's a wide range of views expressed in this anthology, and I think that's really good. But I think to some extent, from my vantage point, it's a question of whether you take up history from below, from the bottom up, or whether you sort of develop your historical approach from above. And if it's from above, it's that Trudeau gave us this great gift in terms of the '69 reform. If you're looking at it from below, and I'm focusing here not only on the parts relating to so-called homosexuality, but also the abortion reform and other parts of the reform. If you're looking at it from below, you have to see what the activists trying to open up space leading to law reform around these questions we're trying to get at in the 1960s. And you have to see how, for instance, Doug Saunders, one of the leading homophile gay activists in the 60s, saw the '69 reform as the translation of homosexual experience, gay experience, into public, private, and adult youth categories that didn't actually really address the issue and didn't actually improve the situation for gay people afterwards. So I think it really does, the tension is there, and it's about how state agencies transform the movements and demands coming from below. And I'll just leave it there and let the editors or other people respond. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. I wanted to signal that Gary and Tom and Karen have all been very much involved in the anti-'69 series of talks and papers. And I know that Tom gave out the link, but maybe Tom, you could repeat it for those who maybe didn't catch it the first time, because I think that that's a really important initiative coming out of the 50-year celebration or marking or rejection of the Omnibus Bill.
Yeah, and so it's www.anti-69.ca. And of course, Christabelle, you were one of our speakers at that conference. So I just want to quickly touch on this idea of 69 being progressive. I'm really glad that Marina brought that up, because I'm not saying that there was no good that came out of the 1969 debates or the reforms. And in fact, there were many queers who celebrated this reform and want to celebrate this reform. But those queers had lots of money, they had lots of privilege, they had private spaces where they could go. My question is does this meet the definition of decriminalization? Decriminalization is not some abstract flowery term. It has a specific meaning. It involves the relationship between queer people and the police. And so that's where my focus is. Well, these debates might have caused or inspired activism down the road. A lot of people have brought that up. That is not decriminalization.
Thank you, Tom. Karen, do you want to say anything else?
If you're not, Karen, we do actually have another question I just saw in the Q&A section. So
Okay.
I will read it out loud, and I'm not sure, maybe one of the authors or someone else.
Chris, I'm just sorry to interrupt, but before you read Rose's question, we have Dawn raised her hand first. So
okay.
If we can hear Dawn question first and then move on to Rose. So Dawn, you have, you can unmute yourself and you can say your comment or question. So
thanks very much. It's Dawn Hemingway here, and I am one of the caravanners from the abortion caravan. And I guess there's two things on my mind. First of all, I'm interested, and I've read some of the earlier pieces that were done about the question of the role of the RCMP and how we were both as caravanners, but also as women who were active in many other political organizations at the time, in Vancouver at SFU, and of course in other locations across the country. The second thing, though, that for me is important, and it came up in one of the comments that was made in response to the last question, and that is the question of what kind of organizing were we doing on the caravan. And for many of us, a really important piece of that work was the fact that we were speaking for ourselves. We were not asking politicians to speak for us. We went to Ottawa, but we knew what we were after, and we were not asking them to speak for us. We spoke ourselves in our own names. And I just wonder if any of the chapter contributors have anything further that they'd like to say about those two aspects. And thank you for this opportunity and for the fact that you put together. It's great.
Does anybody want to answer Dawn? Yeah, I don't know if Steve is still, I mean, I think it's way past his bedtime, but maybe he can, or Gary, did you want to say anything? No, okay. I was just gonna say that Dawn—
I did actually want to say something, but it's okay.
Okay, I just in response to Dawn, I wanted to say that it was really fascinating for Steve and myself to do this research because it was really clear from the RCMP documents that the women were speaking for themselves. In fact, the women were quoted in many of the RCMP documents. The issue was how it was interpreted. And Steve came up with a great phrase, the red tinged prism. And so it didn't matter what the caravanners said they wanted. It was the way in which their words were interpreted and viewed through this red tinged prism. And so on the one hand, this red tinged prism disadvantaged the caravanners. On the other hand, it advantaged the caravanners because, as you well know yourself, that you were able to go into the Parliament buildings. You were able to enter the front lawn of the Prime Minister's residence precisely because your words were not taken seriously. So I think it's also a matter not just of speaking for yourselves, but how you were able to be heard or not heard or interpreted and misinterpreted. Gary?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted and people are hearing me. I think that was an excellent question, and I think I really want to also thank Christabelle for highlighting the abortion caravan. The anniversary is really crucial. This was a really important and early mobilization of the feminist movement. In terms of the RCMP and national security surveillance, I've done a lot of work along with Patricia Gentile on the surveillance of queer organizing in the book called The Canadian War on Queers. And what we see there is it's oftentimes activists who were involved in various social justice and left movements that led the RCMP to do surveillance work on lesbian and gay organizing. It also works that way in relationship to the feminist movement. But I think it's really important for us to actually begin to ask critical questions about national security and how is it that the RCMP and the Canadian government, Canadian state was able to write lesbians and gays out of the nation and to see us as a national security risk, but also to write feminists, especially in their language, unfeminine appearing feminists, out of the fabric of the nation as well. So it raises really important questions about national security that I think we have to continue to see today. And to also recognize that movements for social justice and progressive social transformation themselves become risks to the national security of those forces within the Canadian state who are trying to defend power and privilege, just like Indigenous people have become risks to national security, just like people protesting against the pipelines have become so-called risks to national security. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got a question from Rose Brown that Karen is going to answer. Karen, do you want to unmute your mic and come on back on board? Maybe while you're doing that, I think people can read it there, but just in case you can't, the question is regarding how the bill specifically targeted homosexual men rather than lesbians. How did the bill affect sex between transgender folks, specifically couples that we in 2020 would consider opposite gender, but that authorities in 1969 might have seen as the same sex?
All right, so I think that's a great question, and I don't think I'm completely equipped to answer it properly. There might be other contributors who have more to add. We did talk about this on our anti-69 FAQ on the anti-69 website, where we wrote, trans people or other people found wearing clothes determined by police to be of the wrong gender were arrested on charges of vagrancy. Charges of gross indecency were also used against trans people, including those involved in sex work, even after 1969. So that's the basics. But I think what this question brings up is really the ways in which there were a bunch of laws that affected and that were used by police to arrest, harass, and discriminate against trans people and lesbians and sex workers. And this is where I mentioned Elise Chenier's work, and she's particularly strong on this. And so that I don't think I should go into much detail, but vagrancy was a set of laws that could be used against people who were just on the streets, walking along, living their lives, and the police would address them for vagrancy, for not having a visible means of support, or often for women for vagrancy C, which was the sex work offense at that time. And Chenier tells us that that a lot of sex workers in Toronto, which she studied in the 50s and 60s, were lesbians. Trans people would have been involved in some of these communities as well. And so the gender binary was a lot of what's enforced when you're looking at homophobia. And I think that's the best I can do to answer your question for now.
Okay, I just got a specific question from Lara Campbell for Jessica and maybe others who've done oral history here. Jessica, can you see that one there in the chat section, or do you want to speak to that? Can you see it, or I can read it?
Yes. For you? No, I saw the question. It's a great question. Thank you, Lara. And I've been reflecting in the last couple of minutes on how best to answer it. It was a long time ago that I did the interviews, but I'm not sure I do anything different except maybe embrace the richness of oral history with a little bit more enthusiasm than I started out. I think I was a little bit hesitant because I wasn't as experienced in that particular method of research, but it really was incredibly interesting and valuable. I think looking back on it, I would perhaps just acknowledge a bit more at the time how privileged I was to be hearing these stories and how much these women were offering up, because it wasn't just a specific part or a question about their life. Really, it was a life history that they were sharing in its entirety. And I really got so much out of the interview process, and I learned a lot going through it. I started out and I didn't know as much about oral history as I would have liked, so it was really very educational for me, and I hope it was an equally, perhaps not equally, but I hope it was a positive experience for the women who gave up their time and shared their stories with me. It is certainly interesting to reflect back on it now. As I mentioned, as the mother of 3 daughters, and looking at the choices that they may have, the choices I had, and seeing it very much as the story of women over the generations and the years, and what they overcame to be able to continue their educations, continue their careers, or even have careers at the time. So I think it was just a very, very enriching experience, and certainly the best way to get at some of those more intimate histories.
Any other panelists want to speak to that, or is there another question? I don't hearing anything right yet. Christabelle, I was going to turn to you for, we got your final comments. We want to end the question session, but do you have any final thoughts to say before we head off? Oh, you're still muted, by the way, out of politeness.
Sorry. I just wanted to do my final thank yous. If no one else has a question or a comment, I can move into those. Is that okay with everybody? Yes? All right.
Looks like there's another question in the Q&A.
Oh, pardon me. Okay. Where is this question?
Danny.
Danny, okay. I'd love to hear more about what the contributors have to say about the concept of private versus public and how policing, legalizing certain groups interacted with these conceptions of space. Great question, Danny. Would anybody like to speak to Danny's question? Tom.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead, please.
So the whole idea of there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation create this idea of this private space. And in that private space, morality, the state's morality isn't going to interfere. But in the public space, which in 1969 is defined as everywhere else, so everywhere outside of that closed bedroom with only 2 people in it over 21 years of age, that's the only place that's considered private. Everywhere else is public. Now here's the problem with this. It sounds great, but here's the problem as a historian looking back. And historian Stephen Maynard at Queen's has looked at this. The idea of police busting through bedroom doors in order to make arrests of gross indecency and buggery, this is not the typical case that we find in the records. There are few, but they're few and far between. The vast majority of cases are happening outside of this private bedroom. And the reason for that is simply because, well, it's not simply, it's actually quite complex, is that the avenues for courtship and for dating and for romance and all of these things that heterosexuals believe is the right way to proceed about having intimacy, those weren't available to queers. And for many queers, they weren't interesting for queers. So they had to find, or they desired to find, eroticism elsewhere outside of those bedrooms. Not to mention, going beyond the bedroom was often the only place you could go to find intimate partners if you were queer. So that's kind of my answer to this complicated idea of the public and private and how that plays into 1969.
Gary, go ahead. Unmute.
I am unmuted now, I think, so people should hear me. I just wanted to add on to what Tom said, is that oftentimes people conceive of public and private as sort of being these almost natural ahistorical divisions that exist in the social world, but they're actually historically and socially put in place, and they vary and change historically. So there's been, for instance, legal battles over whether the inside of a car is a private place or a public space, and legal battles over whether the police looking into through a kitchen window and seeing people having sex on their kitchen table, whether that's in public or in private, because it's actually open to public view. So there's a lot of contestation over public and private, and in some ways they're very artificial divisions. And it seems to me one of the best approaches that was developed was by the Right to Privacy Committee in Toronto in resistance to the bath raids, that said that as long as people have engaged in practices of intimacy and constructing privacy for themselves, even if they engage in sexual acts, consensual sexual acts, in state-defined public places, it actually should be completely socially acceptable to do that. So I just wanted to put that forward, that we need to challenge those boundaries and to not simply accept them. Unfortunately, they're actually being accepted once again in the context of COVID-19, where people think that somehow the private sphere is safe, even though many people don't have access to homes. And for many people, women, both cis and trans, and young queer people, being told to stay home is actually being told to stay in an unsafe place. So I just wanted to add that in as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Danny, I would answer your question by saying that this boundary between private and public has always been quite porous. And I think it's really interesting. So for example, the slide that Jessica showed as part of her presentation, you see that personal decisions or decisions that were believed to be personal, like whether or not to take the birth control pill or which kind of birth control pill to take, now become fodder for advertisements. And also, oh, I just saw it. One more ahead. There it is. So you see that this is becoming fodder for advertisements. It's becoming headlined in newspapers and also in magazine features. Similarly, the Abortion Caravan did a wonderful job of making public what was this sort of furtive private act of having an abortion or a backstreet abortion. I think since many of us have already raised the issue of COVID-19, I think it would be fascinating if someone else wanted to take on an edited collection on the relationship of COVID-19 to issues of birth control, abortion, and homosexuality, transgender, etc. We already know that in the United States, there have been attempts to clamp down on abortion, and even more so due to this lockdown, saying that abortions are not medically necessary procedures. And it's really a shame that Rachel, another one of our contributors, could not present today, because that's exactly what she talks about in her chapter about medical necessity and abortion. So the battle between private and public, even though they're very porous spheres, and the battle for each one of them is far from over. So I think it would be great for a new generation of historians to start paying attention to what happens to these spheres post lockdown or during lockdown. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? No.
Can I just say finally, Christabelle, I feel terrible for missing out Rachel Johnston. So I think that was, when I was saying Scott de Groot, I knew there was someone else. That's why I feel terrible that we
I just remembered, yes.
Yeah, very glad you did, which is a great paper, as Christabelle was saying, on questions of medical necessity and abortion.
Yeah, and you know, everyone has to excuse us because it really is our first virtual book launch. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna move. Yes, Chris, did you?
Well, I was going to say, and you're probably going to hate me for saying that there's anything wrong with our book. But every time I come to the end of a project, I think, what could we have done differently? And I'm thinking, you know, about Gary's comments about history from below. I mean, I'm not sure if I quite agree with his framing, but I do think the one gap we didn't have, and this maybe speaks to scholarship and speaks to everyone who's here, including myself, all happily, I'm assuming, and I think it's pretty easy to assume, very happily pro-choice, people who want to commemorate the Abortion Caravan. But I remember sitting through these files in the archives and looking at the huge numbers that petitions came in from this pro-life movement, which just was incredibly spontaneous and incredibly, you know, whatever you think of it, and I'm assuming many people here would not be very keen on it. You know, as I say, I'm a pro-choice person myself, but there's an incredible social movement which spawns from here. And for various reasons, we're not very good in the Academy of telling that story. And I think it'd be great. The one thing I wish is that we'd had a chapter that dealt with that, but.
Yeah, I wish so too. And there are strains of that. For example, the chapter that Steve and I did. It's also in the introduction. I want to single out the work of my colleague at the University of Ottawa, Paul Surrett, and Kelly Gordon, who have done a wonderful book on the history, or not the history, but sort of the evolution of the anti-choice forces, the anti-choice lobby in Canada. And that is referenced, I think, a couple of times in the introduction and also in the article, in the chapter that I did with Steve. But you're absolutely right. This is a growing undercurrent, and even the RCMP files recognize this. Would anyone like to speak to this point?
If I could jump in here, this is Bruce.
Hi, Bruce, go ahead.
Yes. Our chapter does definitely touch on this in the context of within the church. And Katrina, if you're still there, maybe Katrina, you might want to address this a bit.
I asked my question, made my comment, so I don't know, I think you're past.
Hello, what happened?
Are you there? I think you were interrupting Bruce, Karen. Did you notice that or? No?
Sorry, I wasn't speaking. I just wrote a comment in the chat.
Oh, okay. All right. Bruce, do you want to continue?
Oh, yes. I was curious. Katrina, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here, Bruce.
Okay. Perhaps you might speak a little bit to what our chapter had to say about the pro-life movement in terms of, in the context of the pushback.
Yes, absolutely. So in our chapter, we certainly looked at the support for reform within the United Church, but we also did look at, like Bruce had mentioned in the overview, the minority within the United Church that was quite vocal and was pushing for this change. So for a good portion of our chapter, we are looking at this movement and how it was proliferating throughout this period and really shaping the church's response to the anti-abortion movement, but also to its own policy and how it tried to shape its policy to respond to some of the criticism we're receiving and just kind of come to terms with its own objective and how it aligned with the 1969 amendment and the shift that was occurring in society throughout the 70s. And we even look at a bit of the 1980s as well and how it kind of responds to the division it's seeing more broadly.
Thank
Would
you.
you add anything, Bruce?
Nothing much to add to that. I think that, this is something that comes through to some extent in our research, is that when you're looking at the early period, and what I'm talking about is the very early 70s, the pushback within the church didn't really seem to have a sort of party feel to it. It really cut across barriers in terms of gender, in terms of political position, all that sort of thing. But I think it would be, and Katrina, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's probably by the mid-70s that you really see the coalescing of, a particular group that defines themselves more along the lines of pro-life and using the terminology as part of their discourse.
Thank you. Final comments or questions? No. All right. Well, we'll move to the final thank yous. So this book and this book launch could not have happened without the efforts of so many. From the beginning, UBC Press supported this collection, notably Darcy Cullen, who was our first point of contact. And we would like to single out Michelle Vandermeer, whose care and attention to this manuscript was welcome and so remarkable and professional. Thank you so much, Michelle. It was a pleasure to work with all the contributors to this collection who patiently answered our editorial questions and worked so quickly and cooperatively with us. We learned so much from you. Thank you again. My research assistant, Danielle Lynn Caron, affectionately known as Danny, fourth-year student in history at the University of Ottawa. She can do anything. She made a major contribution to the index and provided some background research to the chapter I co-authored with Steve. The idea to hold this book launch came from Radamus Zaki, the PhD candidate in the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's also my research assistant. And Radamus and Carrie Kilmartin at UBC Press have been working closely together to make this launch happen. Many, many thanks to both of you for your enthusiasm and assistance. We absolutely couldn't have done it without you. Of course, I want to thank my co-editor once again for this opportunity to work on this collection. And finally, we would normally be offering you snacks and drinks of variable quality, but of course we can't do that with this virtual book launch. However, we hope that we've offered you a good deal of food for thought. Thank you, audience members, for your participation, and feel free to contact Chris or myself or UBC Press if you have further questions or comments. And please buy the book. Remember that it is discounted for a short period of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.